Hello everyone, I am Mr. Disturbing, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. This story came to me from a man who spent his whole life in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, back when the coal was still king and the forest held secrets that modern folks have forgotten. He was pushing 80 when he told me this, sitting on his porch with a mason jar of something that burned going down, watching the mist roll up from the holler below. Said he'd carried this tale for near 30 years, waiting for the right person to tell it to. Said he reckoned I might understand, being from mountain people myself. I've been living in these hills for 73 years come October, and I seen things that would make a preacher question his faith. My granddaddy used to say the mountains remember everything. Every drop of blood spilled, every soul lost, every promise broken. He wasn't wrong. The Appalachians are old, older than most folks can wrap their minds around, and they got a way of holding on to things that ought to be let go. This happened back in 1987, when Reagan was president, and the mines were already starting to close down around here. The young folks were heading off to Charlotte and Atlanta, looking for work in places that didn't smell like sulfur and coal dust. But some stayed, tied to these mountains by blood and stubbornness and something else they couldn't name. Tommy Whitfield was one of them that stayed. He was 22 that summer, fresh out of the army and back home to his mama's house on Kettle Creek Road. Tommy was built like his daddy had been, tall and lean, with hands that knew how to work and eyes that saw more than most. He'd done a tour in Germany, came back speaking a little German and carrying stories about castles and forests that made our mountains seem tame by comparison. But Tommy learned quick enough that there ain't nothing tame about these hills, not if you know where to look. His sister Beth was 19 then, just finished with her first year at the community college down in Morristown. She was studying to be a nurse, but she spent her summers back home helping their mama tend the garden and preserve food for winter. Beth was the smart one in the family, always had been. She could read the weather by the way the leaves turned and knew which plants would heal and which ones would hurt. Their mama used to say Beth had the gift, though she never said what kind of gift that was. The Whitfield place sat at the end of a gravel road that wound up from the main highway like a snake looking for a warm rock. It was an old house, built by Tommy and Beth's great-grandfather back in 1923, when the logging company was still pulling timber out of these mountains. The house was solid, chestnut beams and fieldstone foundation, but it had that worn look that comes from too many winters and not enough money for paint. Their nearest neighbor was old Buck Morrison, who lived about a half-mile down the holler in a trailer he'd hauled up there in 1975. Buck was 68 and had worked the mines for 40 years before his lungs gave out. He knew every trail and every creek in a 20-mile radius, and he knew the stories that went with them. Buck had been friends with Tommy and Beth's daddy before the heart attack took him, and he'd kind of adopted the family after that, checking on them when the weather got bad and helping Tommy with the heavier work around the place. The trouble started in late July, when the heat was so thick you could cut it with a knife and the cicadas were screaming loud enough to wake the dead. Tommy had gotten work with a crew that was clearing brush for the power company, cutting back the laurel and rhododendron that grew up around the lines. It was hot, miserable work, but it paid decent, and Tommy needed the money if he was going to fix the roof before winter set in. The crew was working a section of line that ran up through what locals called the Ash Fork Hollow, a deep cut between two ridges where the sun barely touched the ground even at midday. It was dark country, thick with old-growth timber that the logging companies had somehow missed. The trees were massive, white oaks and tulip poplars that must have been standing when the Cherokee still hunted these mountains. The understory was so thick with mountain laurel and rhododendron that you couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. Tommy told me later that the first thing he noticed was how quiet it was up there. Not the normal quiet of deep woods, but something else. Something that made the hair on his arm stand up and made him keep looking over his shoulder. The other men felt it too. He could tell by the way they worked faster than usual, not talking much, just wanting to get the job done and get out. It was on a Wednesday when they found the first one. Tommy was working maybe 50 yards from the main crew, cutting back a tangle of greenbrier that had grown up around a power pole when he caught a glimpse of something white through the trees. He figured it was a piece of trash, maybe a plastic bag that had blown in from the road, but when he pushed through the brush to get a better look, he found something that made his blood run cold. It was a deer, a good-sized doe, hanging from a branch about 8 feet off the ground. But it wasn't hanging the way a hunter would hang a deer. This was different. The deer was suspended by its hind legs, and its belly had been opened clean and precise, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing had done the work. The strange part was that the deer was completely white, not just the pale tan of a regular deer, but white as snow, white as bone. Tommy had hunted these mountains since he was old enough to carry a rifle, and he'd never seen an albino deer. More than that, he'd never seen a deer butchered like this one. The cut was too clean, too careful. And there was something else. The deer's eyes were still open, and they were looking right at him. Not the glassy stare of a dead animal, but alert and aware, like it was still alive and watching. He called the other men over, and they stood there in a circle, staring up at the white deer and not saying much. Finally, the foreman, a man named Carson, who'd been working these mountains for 20 years, told them to leave it alone and get back to work. But Tommy could see that Carson was spooked too, the way he kept glancing back at the deer and wiping sweat from his face, even though it was cool under the trees. That evening, Tommy told Beth about what he'd found. They were sitting on the front porch after supper, watching the fireflies blink in the gathering dusk. Beth listened without interrupting, the way she always did, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said that their grandmother had told her stories about white deer back when Beth was little. According to the old woman, white deer were messengers from the other side, creatures that appeared when the boundary between the living world and the dead world was wearing thin. She said the Cherokee believed that killing a white deer would bring a curse on the hunter and his family, but that finding one already dead was even worse. It meant something powerful and hungry had crossed over from the spirit world. Tommy laughed it off, said it was probably just some poacher who'd gotten lucky and found an albino deer. But Beth could see he was troubled by it, the way he kept staring off into the woods and jumping at every sound. The next day, Tommy went back to work in the hollow, but he made sure to stay close to the other men. The white deer was still there, still hanging from the same branch, but something had changed. The meat was gone, not eaten, but carved away with the same precise cuts that had opened the belly. What remained was a perfect skeleton, white bones gleaming in the filtered sunlight, still suspended by tendons and dried skin. Carson took one look at it and called the job off. Said they'd finish the line work somewhere else and come back to the hollow later, maybe in the fall when the leaves were down and they could see better. But Tommy knew they wouldn't be back. He could see it in Carson's eyes, the same look he'd seen on soldiers' faces in Germany when they talked about the old forests there, the places where the trees grew too thick and the shadows moved when they shouldn't. That weekend, Tommy decided to go back to the hollow on his own. He told Beth he wanted to get another look at the deer, maybe take some pictures to show the game warden. But the real reason was that he couldn't stop thinking about it. The image of those white bones hanging in the green shadows had worked its way into his mind like a splinter, and he knew he wouldn't have any peace until he understood what he'd seen. He asked Beth to come with him, and after some thought, she agreed. They packed a lunch and some water, and on Saturday morning they drove up the mountain road to where the power line crossed the highway. The access road was barely more than a dirt track, rutted from heavy trucks and grown over with weeds. Tommy's pickup bounced and scraped along the uneven ground, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air. They parked at the end of the access road and walked up along the power line, following the cleared swath through the forest. The day was overcast with low clouds that seemed to catch in the treetops and turn the world gray and muffled. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of rotting leaves and stagnant water. When they reached the place where Tommy had found the deer, it was gone. Not just the meat, the whole thing, bones and all. The branch it had hung from was still there, but there was no sign that anything had ever been suspended from it. No marks on the bark, no staining on the ground below, nothing. Tommy stood there staring at the empty branch, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He knew he hadn't imagined it, the other men had seen it too. But now there was nothing, as if the white deer had never existed at all. Beth walked around the area, studying the ground and the trees with the careful attention she'd learned from their grandmother. After a few minutes, she called Tommy over to look at something. She was kneeling beside a large oak tree, pointing at marks in the bark about 7 feet off the ground. They looked like scratches, but they were too deep and too regular to be from an animal. They formed a pattern, a series of lines and curves that almost looked like letters, but not from any alphabet Tommy recognized. Below the marks, the ground was torn up, as if something large had been digging or scraping at the earth. The soil was dark and rich, but it had an odd smell, like copper pennies and old meat. Beth touched the disturbed earth with her fingertip, then quickly pulled her hand back. She stood up and wiped her finger on her jeans, but Tommy could see that her hand was shaking. They decided to explore a little further into the hollow, following a faint trail that led away from the power line and deeper into the forest. The trail was old, probably cut by deer or maybe by hunters years ago, and it wound between the massive trees like a thread through a maze. The deeper they went, the darker it became, even though it was still midday. The canopy was so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight reached the forest floor, creating a patchwork of light and shadow that played tricks on the eyes. After about 20 minutes of walking, they came to a small clearing where the trail forked. In the center of the clearing was a pile of stones, carefully arranged in a rough circle about 6 feet across. The stones were covered with moss and lichen, and they looked like they'd been there for a very long time. But what caught Tommy's attention was what was inside the circle. It was bones, lots of them, scattered across the ground like someone had dumped a bucket of them there. Most were small, birds and squirrels, maybe a few rabbits. But mixed in with the small bones were larger ones, the kind that might have come from deer. And at the center of the pile was something that made Tommy's stomach turn. It was a skull, bleached white and perfectly clean, but it was too big to be from any animal Tommy knew. It was almost human-sized, but the shape was wrong, elongated and twisted, with too many teeth. Beth backed away from the stone circle, her face pale. She grabbed Tommy's arm and pulled him toward the trail fork that led back the way they'd come. But as they turned to leave, they heard something that froze them in place. It was a sound like singing, but not quite. More like humming, a low, wordless melody that seemed to come from all directions at once. The sound was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like the voices of angels with their throats cut. It rose and fell in waves, sometimes loud enough to echo off the trees, sometimes so soft they could barely hear it. Tommy and Beth ran. They didn't talk about it, didn't plan it, they just ran. They crashed through the underbrush, following the trail back toward the power line, branches whipping at their faces and roots catching at their feet. The humming followed them, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there, like a dog following a scent. They didn't stop running until they reached the pickup truck, and even then Tommy had trouble getting the key in the ignition because his hands were shaking so badly. They drove back down the mountain in silence, neither of them wanting to talk about what they'd seen and heard. That night, Beth couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the sounds of the forest outside her window, the usual chorus of crickets and tree frogs and night birds. But underneath the familiar sounds, she thought she could hear something else. That humming, so faint she might have been imagining it, drifting up from the hollow like mist. She got up and went to the window, pushing aside the curtains to look out at the dark line of trees that marked the edge of their property. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light and deep shadow. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then, at the edge of the tree line, she saw movement. It was white, pale as moonlight, moving between the trees with a fluid grace that didn't look quite natural. At first, she thought it might be a deer, but as she watched, she realized it was walking upright, like a person. It was tall, taller than any person she'd ever seen, and its arms were too long for its body. It moved through the trees without making a sound, gliding rather than walking, and it seemed to be heading toward the house. Beth wanted to call out to Tommy, to wake him up and tell him to come look, but she found she couldn't speak. The thing at the edge of the trees had stopped moving and was now standing perfectly still, looking directly at her window. Even from that distance, she could see its eyes, pale and luminous in the moonlight, fixed on her with an intelligence that was both ancient and alien. They stared at each other across the yard, the girl at the window and the white thing at the edge of the forest. Beth felt a strange calm settle over her, as if the fear had been drawn out of her body and replaced with something else. She understood, in that moment, that she was looking at something that had been waiting for her, something that had been calling to her family for generations. The thing raised one long arm and pointed at her, and Beth felt a pull in her chest, a tugging sensation like a fishhook in her heart. She knew, without knowing how she knew, that it wanted her to come outside, to walk across the yard and into the forest. The urge was almost overwhelming, like the strongest thirst she'd ever felt, but magnified 100-fold. She might have done it, might have walked right out of the house and into the waiting arms of whatever was calling to her, but at that moment Tommy's voice came from the hallway behind her, asking if she was all right. The sound of his voice broke the spell, and Beth stumbled backward from the window, gasping as if she'd been holding her breath. When she looked back at the tree line, the white thing was gone. The next morning, Beth told Tommy what she'd seen, and he listened with the same careful attention she'd shown him when he told her about the deer. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup like he might find answers there. Finally, he said they needed to talk to Buck Morrison. Buck had lived in these mountains longer than anyone, and if there was something strange happening in the hollow, he'd know about it. They drove down to Buck's trailer and found him sitting in his usual spot on the front steps, smoking a cigarette and watching the clouds build up over the ridge. She got up and went to the window, pushing aside the curtains to look out at the dark line of trees that marked the edge of their property. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light and deep shadow. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then, at the edge of the tree line, she saw movement. It was white, pale as moonlight, moving between the trees with a fluid grace that didn't look quite natural. At first, she thought it might be a deer, but as she watched, she realized it was walking upright, like a person. It was tall, taller than any person she'd ever seen, and its arms were too long for its body. It moved through the trees without making a sound, gliding rather than walking, and it seemed to be heading toward the house. Beth wanted to call out to Tommy, to wake him up and tell him to come look, but she found she couldn't speak. The thing at the edge of the trees had stopped moving and was now standing perfectly still, looking directly at her window. Even from that distance, she could see its eyes, pale and luminous in the moonlight, fixed on her with an intelligence that was both ancient and alien. They stared at each other across the yard, the girl at the window and the white thing at the edge of the forest. Beth felt a strange calm settle over her, as if the fear had been drawn out of her body and replaced with something else. She understood, in that moment, that she was looking at something that had been waiting for her, something that had been calling to her family for generations. The thing raised one long arm and pointed at her, and Beth felt a pull in her chest, a tugging sensation like a fishhook in her heart. She knew, without knowing how she knew, that it wanted her to come outside, to walk across the yard and into the forest. The urge was almost overwhelming, like the strongest thirst she'd ever felt, but magnified 100-fold. She might have done it, might have walked right out of the house and into the waiting arms of whatever was calling to her, but at that moment Tommy's voice came from the hallway behind her, asking if she was all right. The sound of his voice broke the spell, and Beth stumbled backward from the window, gasping as if she'd been holding her breath. When she looked back at the tree line, the white thing was gone. The next morning, Beth told Tommy what she'd seen, and he listened with the same careful attention she'd shown him when he told her about the deer. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup like he might find answers there. Finally, he said they needed to talk to Buck Morrison. Buck had lived in these mountains longer than anyone, and if there was something strange happening in the hollow, he'd know about it. They drove down to Buck's trailer and found him sitting in his usual spot on the front steps, smoking a cigarette and watching the clouds build up over the ridge. Buck listened to their story without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking a question for clarification. When they finished, he was quiet for so long that Tommy thought he might have fallen asleep. Finally, the old man stubbed out his cigarette and looked at them with eyes that had seen too much. He told them about the Ash Fork Hollow, about the stories his grandfather had told him when he was a boy. According to the old tales, the hollow had been a sacred place for the Cherokee, a spot where the spirits of the dead gathered before making their journey to the nightland. The Cherokee had left offerings there, food and tobacco and carved bones, to ensure safe passage for their departed loved ones. But something had gone wrong, Buck said. Maybe it was the arrival of white settlers. Maybe it was the logging and mining that had torn up the land. Or maybe it was just the natural progression of things. The spirits that were supposed to guide the dead to their rest had become twisted and hungry, feeding on the offerings and growing stronger with each passing year. The white deer, Buck explained, was a warning. It meant that the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was breaking down, and something was trying to cross over. The thing Beth had seen at the tree line was just the beginning, a scout testing the strength of the barrier. Buck's grandfather had told him that there was a way to stop it, but it required a sacrifice. Someone from the bloodline that had first disturbed the hollow, the family that had cut the trees and built the first cabin in the area, would have to go back to the stone circle and offer themselves to the spirits. Only then would the boundary be sealed and the dead allowed to rest. Tommy and Beth exchanged glances. Their great-grandfather had been one of the first white settlers in the area, one of the men who'd worked for the logging company. If Buck was right, then their family was responsible for what was happening, and they were the only ones who could stop it. But Buck wasn't finished. He told them that the sacrifice didn't have to be a death. Not exactly. The spirits wanted a life, but they would accept a different kind of payment. Someone could go to the stone circle and offer to take the place of the trapped souls, to become a guide for the dead in exchange for sealing the boundary. It would mean giving up their human life, but they would survive in a different form. Tommy said he would do it, but Beth shook her head. She was the one with the gift, she said. She was the one who could see and hear things that others couldn't. If anyone was going to make this sacrifice, it should be her. They argued about it for the rest of the day, but in the end, Beth won. She was determined to go to the hollow that night, during the full moon, when the boundary would be at its thinnest. Tommy said he would go with her, but she refused. This was something she had to do alone. That evening, as the sun set behind the ridge and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Beth packed a small bag with a few personal items, a photograph of her parents, a carved wooden bird that had belonged to her grandmother, and a small silver cross that her mother had given her. She kissed Tommy goodbye and told him she loved him, then walked out into the night. Tommy watched from the window as she disappeared into the tree line, her white dress ghostly in the moonlight. He wanted to follow her, but he knew she was right. This was something she had to do alone. Instead, he sat on the porch and waited, listening to the sounds of the forest and trying not to think about what might be happening in the hollow. Around midnight, the humming started again. It was louder this time, more complex, like a choir of voices singing in harmony. The sound rose and fell, sometimes beautiful, sometimes terrible, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Tommy could feel it in his bones, in his teeth, in the very air around him. The humming continued for what felt like hours, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was complete, as if every living thing in the forest had stopped breathing at the same moment. Tommy sat on the porch, straining his ears for any sound, but there was nothing. As the sun began to rise, Tommy walked to the edge of the tree line, calling Beth's name. There was no answer, no sign that she had ever been there. He followed the trail into the forest, retracing the path they had taken to the stone circle. But when he reached the clearing, it was empty. The bones were gone, the stones had been scattered, and the twisted skull was nowhere to be seen. In the center of where the circle had been, there was a patch of new grass, green and healthy, as if something had been planted there and was already beginning to grow. Tommy never saw his sister again, but he didn't think she was dead. Sometimes, on nights when the moon was full and the mist was rising from the hollow, he would hear her voice mixed in with the wind. She was singing, he thought, or maybe humming, a wordless melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The white thing never came back to the house, and the power company eventually finished their work in the hollow without any further incidents. But Tommy knew that Beth was still there, somewhere in the deep woods, guiding the spirits of the dead to their rest and keeping the boundary between worlds sealed. Maybe you've seen something like this and just didn't realize it. That moment when the world feels thin and you catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. Years passed and Tommy eventually moved away from the mountains. But he never forgot what had happened in the Ash Fork Hollow. He married a woman from Georgia and had 2 children. But he never told them about their Aunt Beth or what she had sacrificed for them. Some stories, he figured, were better left untold. But on quiet nights when the wind is blowing through the trees and the moon is full, he still listens for that humming, that wordless song that drifts up from the hollow like mist. And sometimes, just sometimes, he thinks he can hear her voice, calling to him from the deep woods, reminding him that some debts can never be fully paid, only transferred from one generation to the next. The old man who told me this story passed away last winter, but before he died, he gave me a map he'd drawn of the hollow, with the location of the stone circle marked in red ink. I've never been there myself, but I've heard others talk about it, hunters and hikers who've wandered off the main trails and found themselves in places where the trees grow too thick and the shadows move when they shouldn't. They say the hollow is still there, still waiting, and that on certain nights, you can still hear the humming. That wordless song that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They say if you listen carefully, you can hear a woman's voice mixed in with the wind, calling to the lost souls and guiding them home, but I wouldn't recommend going to look for it. Some places are better left undisturbed, and some stories are meant to stay buried in the deep woods where they belong. The mountains remember everything, and some memories are too dangerous to disturb. What I'm about to tell you is something I've never shared outside the family. It happened over 30 years ago, back when I was younger, stronger, and thought I understood what danger really meant. I didn't. Not until that October. My name is Harlan, and I've lived in these mountains all my 73 years. Born and raised in a hollow so deep the sun only touches the bottom for 3 hours each day. Back then, in 1989, I was 41 years old, married to my sweet Dolores, and working the night shift at the lumber mill down in Beckley. But this story isn't about mill work or marriage troubles. It's about what happened when the autumn leaves started falling and the old stories my grandmother used to tell stopped feeling like stories at all. The Appalachian Mountains have always been a place where the modern world moves slow to catch up. Even in '89, there were hollows where running water was still a luxury, where folks heated their homes with wood-burning stoves, and where the darkness between the ridges held secrets that went back centuries. Our hollow was one of those places. We called it Kettle Creek Hollow, though no creek ran through it anymore. The strip mining had dried up the water table decades before I was born, leaving behind a landscape of scars and silence. I lived with my wife in a small cabin that had belonged to my grandfather, about 2 miles up the hollow from where the old mining road ended. Beyond our place, the mountains rose sharp and wild, covered in oak, hickory, and pine so thick you could walk for days without seeing the sun. It was beautiful country, but it was also lonesome country, the kind of place where you could disappear and not be found for months, if at all. The trouble started with my cousin Virgil. He was 28 that year, about 13 years younger than me, and had always been the adventurous type. Virgil had spent 4 years in the Navy, seen the world, and come back to West Virginia with a head full of stories about places where the mountains weren't always watching you. He'd been staying with his mama, my Aunt Beulah, since he got back from the service, but he was restless, always talking about leaving again, about finding somewhere new. That's why I wasn't surprised when Virgil showed up at my door that October morning, carrying a hunting rifle and a backpack full of camping gear. He had this wild look in his eyes, the kind of excitement that young men get when they think they've discovered something nobody else knows about. The morning was crisp, with the kind of clear sky that makes the mountains look like they're cut from blue glass. The maples were turning red and gold, and the air carried the smell of wood smoke from chimneys throughout the hollow. Virgil sat on my porch and told me about what he'd found while hunting deer up on Bald Mountain, the tallest peak in our area. Bald Mountain got its name honestly. The top was bare rock, worn smooth by wind and weather, with a view that stretched for miles in every direction. Most folks avoided it because the climb was treacherous, all loose stone and sudden drop-offs. But Virgil had made it to the top 3 days before, and what he'd seen there had brought him straight to my door. He described finding a series of caves near the summit, caves that hadn't been marked on any map he'd ever seen. The entrance was hidden behind a stand of dead hemlocks, trees that had been killed by some kind of blight years ago but never fell down. They stood like gray sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. What made Virgil's discovery unusual wasn't just the caves themselves, though cave systems were common enough in our limestone mountains. It was what he'd found inside the first chamber. Carved into the stone walls were symbols that didn't look like anything he'd ever seen before. Not Indian petroglyphs, which we had plenty of in the area, but something else entirely. Something older. The symbols were deep cuts in the rock, filled with what looked like a black substance that gleamed in the light of his flashlight. They formed patterns that seemed to shift and change when you looked at them directly, as if they were trying to tell you something but couldn't quite form the words. Virgil said they reminded him of musical notes, but notes for a song that no human throat could sing. More disturbing than the symbols were the bones. Scattered throughout the cave floor were the remains of animals: deer, bear, wild turkey, even a few that Virgil couldn't identify, but they weren't the clean white bones you'd expect from natural death. These were blackened, as if they'd been burned, and they crumbled to dust when touched. Some of the larger bones showed what looked like tool marks, precise cuts that suggested intelligence behind the killing. Virgil wanted me to come with him to see this place. He said he'd been thinking about it for 3 days straight, couldn't get the image of those symbols out of his head. He'd even started hearing things at night, a low humming sound that seemed to come from the direction of Bald Mountain. His mama had noticed him acting strange, he admitted, walking the floors at night and staring out the window toward the peaks. I should have said no. I should have told him to leave whatever he'd found up there alone, to forget about it and find something else to occupy his mind. But I was curious too. I'd lived in these mountains my whole life, and I thought I knew every secret they held. The idea that there was something up there, something that had been hidden for who knows how long, pulled at me like a fishhook. We decided to make it a 2-day trip. Virgil had already planned out the route. We'd hike up through the old logging roads as far as we could drive my truck, then make camp about halfway up the mountain. The next morning, we'd tackle the difficult climb to the summit and the caves. It would give us plenty of time to explore and still get back before dark the second day. I told Dolores I was going hunting with Virgil, which wasn't exactly a lie. We did bring rifles, and there was always the chance we'd see deer or turkey on the way up. But I didn't mention the caves or the symbols. Something about the whole thing felt like it should be kept quiet, at least until we knew more about what we were dealing with. The morning we left was October 15th, a Thursday. The weather was perfect for hiking, cool but not cold, with a light breeze that carried the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. We loaded my old Ford pickup with our gear and headed up the hollow toward the mountain. The road up to Bald Mountain was barely a road at all. It had been cut by logging companies back in the 1960s, but time and weather had worn it down to a muddy track full of ruts and washouts. We could only drive about 4 miles before the truck couldn't go any further. The rest of the way would be on foot. The forest was beautiful that morning. The canopy was a tapestry of red, gold, and orange, with shafts of sunlight cutting through the trees like spotlights. Squirrels chattered in the branches above us, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker hammered against a dead tree. It was the kind of morning that made you feel grateful to be alive, to be walking in country that had been unchanged for thousands of years. We made good time on the lower slopes, following what remained of the old logging road. The path wound back and forth across the mountainside, gaining elevation gradually. Virgil was in good spirits, talking about his plans for after we explored the caves. He was thinking about starting a guide service, he said, taking city folks up into the mountains to show them the real Appalachian wilderness. He figured the caves could be a draw, something unique that would set him apart from other guides. I listened to him talk, but part of my mind was focused on the mountain itself. The higher we climbed, the quieter the forest became. The bird calls that had filled the air at the bottom of the mountain faded away, replaced by a silence that felt almost solid. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the mountain were absorbing sound. By noon, we'd reached the spot where Virgil wanted to make camp. It was a small clearing about 2/3 of the way up the mountain, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out most of the sky. A small spring bubbled up from the rocks nearby, providing fresh water. It was a good spot, sheltered from the wind and level enough to sleep comfortably. We set up our tent and built a fire ring from stones we found scattered around the clearing. The afternoon was warm enough that we didn't need a fire yet, but we'd want one when the sun went down. Mountain nights in October could be bitter cold, especially at elevation. After lunch, Virgil suggested we scout out the route to the caves. The climb to the summit was steep and dangerous, and he wanted to make sure we could find our way in the early morning light. I agreed, though I was beginning to feel uneasy about the whole expedition. The silence of the forest was getting to me, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more often than usual. The path to the summit was treacherous. Above our campsite, the mountain turned into a series of rocky ledges separated by steep climbs through loose stone and dead vegetation. Several times we had to use our hands to pull ourselves up over obstacles, and I began to wonder how Virgil had managed to make this climb alone with a full pack. As we climbed higher, the forest changed. The healthy pines and hardwoods gave way to stunted, twisted trees that looked like they'd been fighting a losing battle against the elements for decades. Many of the trees were dead, their bark stripped away by wind and ice, leaving behind gray, skeletal trunks that creaked and groaned even in the light breeze. The temperature dropped noticeably as we gained altitude. My breath began to mist in the air, and I could feel the bite of mountain cold creeping through my jacket. The sun seemed weaker up here, filtered through a haze that I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't clouds exactly, but something thinner, like smoke or morning mist that refused to burn off. We reached the stand of dead hemlocks just as the sun was beginning to set. Virgil had described them accurately. They stood in a rough circle, their branches interlocked like the fingers of praying hands. The trees had been magnificent once, each one probably 50 or 60 feet tall, but now they were monuments to death. Not a single needle remained on their branches, and their bark had fallen away in long strips that carpeted the ground beneath them. Beyond the hemlocks, the mountain rose in a final, steep climb to the bare rock summit. I could see the cave entrance Virgil had described, a dark opening in the stone face that looked like a mouth frozen in a scream. Even from a distance, there was something unsettling about it. The shadows around the entrance seemed deeper than they should be, and I found myself reluctant to look directly at it. Virgil was excited to show me what he'd found, but I convinced him to wait until morning. The climb to the cave entrance would be dangerous in the dark, and we didn't have enough daylight left to explore safely. Reluctantly, he agreed, and we made our way back down to camp. The descent was more treacherous than the climb up had been. The loose stones shifted under our feet, and more than once I had to grab onto dead branches to keep from falling. The light was fading fast, and by the time we reached our campsite, the forest was already deep in shadow. We built up our fire as soon as we arrived, more for comfort than warmth. The flames cast dancing shadows on the trees around us, and the crackling of burning wood was a welcome sound after the unnatural silence of the upper mountain. We cooked a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, washing it down with coffee that tasted like nectar after the cold climb. As night fell, the temperature dropped even further. I added more wood to the fire and zipped my jacket up to my chin. The stars were brilliant in the clear mountain air, more stars than you could ever see from the valley below. But their light seemed cold and distant, offering no warmth or comfort. Virgil was restless. He kept looking up toward the summit, toward the caves we'd visit in the morning. He talked about the symbols he'd found, trying to describe them in detail, but his words kept trailing off as if he couldn't quite capture what he'd seen. Several times, he stopped talking mid-sentence and tilted his head, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I asked him about it, and he said he wasn't sure. It might have been the wind, he said, or maybe some kind of animal call. But it sounded almost like music, a low humming that seemed to come from the mountain itself. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the pop and crackle of our fire and the distant hoot of an owl. We turned in around 10 o'clock, both of us exhausted from the day's climb. The tent was small but warm, and I was grateful for the down sleeping bag that Dolores had insisted I bring. Outside, the wind had picked up, setting the dead trees around our campsite to creaking and groaning like the timbers of an old ship. I was just beginning to drift off when I heard it, the humming sound Virgil had described. It was low and rhythmic, almost like a lullaby, but there was something alien about it. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard, and it certainly wasn't the wind. The sound seemed to be coming from above us, from the direction of the summit. I lay still, listening. The humming continued for what felt like hours, rising and falling in a pattern that was almost hypnotic. Sometimes it would fade away entirely, leaving only the sound of wind in the trees, then return stronger than before. I wanted to wake Virgil, to ask him if he was hearing it too, but something held me back. The sound was strangely beautiful, despite its alien quality, and I found myself reluctant to break the spell. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, Virgil was shaking me awake. The tent was filled with gray morning light, and I could hear birds singing in the distance. The humming sound was gone, replaced by the normal sounds of a mountain morning. We broke camp quickly, eating a cold breakfast of granola bars and instant coffee. The morning air was crisp and clean, and the unease I'd felt the night before seemed foolish in the cheerful light of day. We packed our gear and began the climb to the summit, both of us eager to see what secrets the mountain held. The climb in daylight was easier than it had been the evening before, but it was still treacherous. The loose stone shifted under our feet, and several times we had to help each other over particularly difficult sections. The dead trees seemed even more skeletal in the morning light, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. We reached the cave entrance just as the sun was reaching its highest point. The opening was larger than it had appeared from a distance, easily big enough for a man to walk through upright. The stone around the entrance was smooth and black, polished by centuries of weather. But it was the symbols that caught my attention. They were exactly as Virgil had described, deep cuts in the rock, filled with some kind of black substance that gleamed like oil. The patterns they formed were complex and beautiful, but looking at them directly made my eyes water. They seemed to shift and flow, as if they were alive, and I found myself having to look away after a few seconds. Virgil was already inside the cave, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls. I followed him, my own light adding to the illumination. The cave was larger than I'd expected, with a high ceiling that disappeared into darkness above us. The walls were covered with more symbols, thousands of them, creating a tapestry of meaning that was both beautiful and terrifying. The bones Virgil had mentioned were scattered across the floor, just as he'd described. But there were more of them than I'd expected, and they weren't just animal bones. Mixed in with the blackened remains of deer and bear were bones that looked disturbingly human, skulls with eye sockets that seemed to stare accusingly at us, rib cages that had been split open with surgical precision. As we explored deeper into the cave, the symbols on the walls became more complex. They formed spirals and geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, and I began to feel dizzy. The air in the cave was thick and heavy, carrying a smell that was both sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in water. At the back of the cave, we found something that made both of us stop dead in our tracks. It was a raised platform, carved from the living rock of the mountain. On the platform was what looked like an altar, its surface stained black with something that might have been blood. Around the altar were arranged dozens of objects, stones carved with symbols, pieces of metal twisted into impossible shapes, and what looked like preserved organs in glass jars. But it was what stood behind the altar that made my blood run cold. It was a statue, carved from the same black stone as the cave walls, but it depicted something that had never walked on this earth. The figure was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in every detail. Its proportions were distorted, its limbs too long and jointed in places where no joints should be. Its face was a mass of writhing tentacles surrounding a mouth filled with needle-sharp teeth. The statue's eyes were the worst part. They were carved from some kind of crystal that seemed to glow with its own inner light, and they followed us as we moved around the altar. I found myself unable to look away from them, drawn by a fascination that was both irresistible and terrifying. Virgil was examining the objects on the altar, his flashlight beam revealing details that made my stomach turn. The preserved organs were not from any animal I could identify. They were too large, too complex, with structures that defied anatomy. Some of them were still moving, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat that matched the humming sound I'd heard the night before. It was then that I realized we were not alone in the cave. The humming sound had returned, but now it was coming from all around us, echoing off the walls and ceiling. It was louder than it had been the night before, and I could feel it in my bones, a vibration that seemed to resonate with something deep inside my chest. The symbols on the walls began to glow with the same inner light as the statue's eyes. The black substance that filled the carved lines was moving, flowing like liquid mercury, and the patterns they formed were shifting and changing before our eyes. The air in the cave grew thick and oppressive, and I found it difficult to breathe. Virgil was transfixed by what he was seeing. He stood before the altar, his flashlight forgotten in his hand, staring at the statue with an expression of wonder and terror. The humming sound grew louder, and I could see his lips moving, as if he were trying to sing along with the alien melody. I grabbed his arm and tried to pull him away from the altar, but he resisted. His skin was cold to the touch, and when he turned to look at me, his eyes were different. They reflected the light of the glowing symbols, and there was something ancient and hungry in their depths. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sound that came out was not his voice. It was the humming, the same alien melody that filled the cave, coming from his throat. The statue's eyes flared brighter, and I felt something touch my mind. It was like ice water flooding through my thoughts, washing away everything that made me human, and replacing it with something older and more terrible. I saw visions of the mountain as it had been millions of years ago, when the earth was young and different laws governed reality. I saw the things that had carved these symbols, beings of such alien intelligence that the human mind could barely comprehend their existence. They had been here long before the first humans crossed the land bridge from Asia. They had carved these caves and performed rituals that opened doorways between worlds. They had fed on the life force of whatever creatures they could find, growing stronger with each sacrifice. And when the ice came and the world changed, they had gone to sleep, waiting for the time when they would wake again. That time was now. The symbols on the walls were not just decorations. They were instructions, a manual for awakening the sleepers. And Virgil, by studying them, by bringing me here, had begun the process. I managed to break free from the mental grip that held me, but it was like swimming up from the bottom of a deep, dark lake. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of the cave and away from the mountain as fast as I could. But I couldn't leave Virgil behind. He was my cousin, my family, and despite the alien intelligence that was taking control of his mind, I had to try to save him. I grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him, trying to break the spell that held him. For a moment his eyes cleared and I saw the Virgil I knew looking back at me. But then the humming grew louder, and the light from the symbols pulsed brighter, and he was gone again. The statue behind the altar was moving now, its carved features shifting and changing as if it were alive. The crystal eyes tracked our movement, and I could feel its attention like a physical weight. The preserved organs on the altar were pulsing faster, and the smell of rot and decay was growing stronger. I knew we had to leave, but Virgil was no longer responding to my attempts to drag him away. He was part of the ritual now, his life force being drawn into the awakening process. The humming sound was coming from his throat, and his body was changing, becoming more like the statue with each passing moment. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I picked up one of the heavy stones from the altar and smashed it against the wall of symbols. The black substance that filled the carved lines splattered like blood, and the humming sound faltered for a moment. The statue's eyes dimmed slightly, and Virgil stumbled backward, his own eyes flickering with confusion. I hit the wall again, destroying more of the symbols. Each impact sent shockwaves through the cave, and I could feel the ancient intelligence that inhabited this place recoiling in pain and rage. The humming sound became a shriek, and the air in the cave began to vibrate with malevolent energy. The statue was fully alive now, its impossible anatomy shifting and flowing as it stepped down from its pedestal. It moved toward us with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, its tentacle-covered face writhing with alien emotion. The crystal eyes blazed with hatred and hunger, and I knew that if it reached us, we would become part of its collection of preserved organs. I grabbed Virgil's hand and ran for the cave entrance, dragging him behind me. He was fighting the alien influence, but it was a losing battle. His body was changing, becoming something that was no longer entirely human. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his eyes were beginning to glow with the same inner light as the statue's. We reached the cave entrance just as the mountain began to shake. The ancient thing we had awakened was angry, and its rage was literally moving the earth. Rocks fell from the cave ceiling and cracks appeared in the walls. The symbols were glowing brighter than ever. and the humming sound had become a roar that seemed to come from the very core of the mountain. I pulled Virgil out of the cave and started down the treacherous slope toward our campsite. The mountain was convulsing now, shaking loose stones and dead trees. The sky had grown dark despite the fact that it was still midday, and the air was filled with a sound like screaming wind. Virgil was fighting me every step of the way. The alien influence was strong in him now, and he wanted to go back to the cave, to complete the ritual that would fully awaken the sleeper. But I held on to him, dragging him down the mountainside even as the ground shifted and buckled beneath our feet. We reached our campsite just as the mountain gave one final, violent shudder. The sound was like thunder, but deeper and more resonant, as if the earth itself were crying out in pain. Trees fell around us, their roots torn from the suddenly unstable soil. The spring that had provided our water was now running red, as if the mountain were bleeding. I threw our gear into the truck and pushed Virgil into the passenger seat. He was no longer fighting me, but he wasn't himself either. He sat staring up at the mountain, his glowing eyes reflecting the strange light that was now emanating from the summit. The humming sound was coming from his throat again, but quieter now, almost like a lullaby. The drive down the mountain was a nightmare. The logging road was blocked in several places by fallen trees and rock slides. More than once I had to get out and move debris by hand, all while Virgil sat in the truck, humming that alien melody and staring at the mountain with eyes that were no longer entirely human. We finally reached the main road just as the sun was setting. The mountain behind us was glowing with an eerie light, and I could see shapes moving in the sky above the summit. They were too far away to make out clearly, but they didn't move like any bird or aircraft I'd ever seen. I drove straight to the hospital in Beckley, telling the emergency room staff that Virgil had suffered some kind of seizure on the mountain. They admitted him for observation, but the doctors couldn't find anything wrong with him. His vital signs were normal. His blood work came back clean, and he seemed lucid and coherent. The only unusual thing was his eyes, which continued to glow with that faint inner light. I visited him every day for a week, but he wasn't the same person. He spoke normally, answered questions appropriately, and seemed to remember our trip to the mountain. But there was something else behind his eyes now, something ancient and patient. He would sit by the window, staring out at the mountains, and I could hear him humming that alien melody under his breath. On the 8th day, I arrived at the hospital to find his room empty. The nurses said he had checked himself out early that morning against medical advice. They had tried to convince him to stay, but he had insisted he was fine. He had walked out of the hospital carrying nothing but the clothes on his back, heading north toward the mountains. I drove up to Kettle Creek Hollow to Aunt Beulah's house, but Virgil wasn't there. She said she hadn't seen him since the day we'd left for our camping trip. I drove up the hollow to the old mining road, but my truck was still too wide to navigate the narrow track. I would have to go on foot. I found him at our old campsite, sitting in the clearing where we had pitched our tent. He was facing the mountain, his back to me, and he was humming that same alien melody. The sound was clearer now, more complex, as if he were learning to speak a language that had no words. I called his name, but he didn't turn around. I walked closer, and I could see that the changes in his body had progressed. His skin had taken on a grayish, almost translucent quality, and I could see strange patterns beneath the surface, like the symbols from the cave. His hair had fallen out, and his scalp was covered with the same flowing patterns. When he finally turned to look at me, I saw that his face was no longer entirely human. His features had become more angular, more alien, and his eyes were blazing with that inner light. But worst of all, his mouth had changed. It was larger than it should have been, and when he opened it to speak, I could see that his teeth had become needle-sharp, just like the statue in the cave. He tried to talk to me, but the sounds that came from his throat were not words. They were the same humming melody, but more complex now, with harmonics and overtones that made my head spin. I realized he was trying to teach me the song, to make me understand what he had learned in the cave. I backed away from him, but he stood up and followed me. His movements were different now, more fluid and graceful, as if he were no longer bound by the limitations of human anatomy. He reached out toward me, and I could see that his fingers had grown longer, with joints in places where no joints should be. I ran. I ran down the mountain as fast as I could, crashing through the underbrush and not caring about the branches that tore at my clothes and skin. Behind me, I could hear him following, but he wasn't running. He was floating, gliding through the forest without making a sound. I reached my truck and drove away, not stopping until I was back in the hollow where Dolores was waiting. I told her that Virgil had decided to stay on the mountain, that he was going through some kind of spiritual crisis and needed time alone. She accepted the story, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. That was 33 years ago. I never saw Virgil again, but I know he's still up there. On quiet nights, when the wind is still and the sky is clear, I can hear him singing. The melody has grown more complex over the years, more beautiful and more terrible. Sometimes I catch myself humming along, and I have to stop myself before the song takes hold. The mountain is different now. Hikers and hunters report strange things, lights in the sky, sounds that don't belong to any earthly creature, and areas where the forest has died for no apparent reason. The state has closed off the upper reaches of Bald Mountain, citing unstable geology and dangerous conditions. But I know the real reason. They're trying to keep people away from whatever is awakening up there. Sometimes, on the darkest nights, I dream about the cave. I see the symbols glowing on the walls, and I hear the alien melody that changed my cousin into something else. In my dreams, I can understand the song, and I know what it means. It's a calling, a summoning, drawing others to the mountain to join the choir that Virgil has become. I'm 73 years old now, and I don't have many years left. My health is failing, and the doctors say my heart won't last much longer. But I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of what might happen when I do. Because in my dreams, I can see Virgil waiting for me at the mouth of that cave, his transformed face lit by the glow of ancient symbols, his inhuman voice singing the song that will make me like him. The mountain is patient. It has waited millions of years for the right time to wake up, and it can wait a little longer. But when the time comes, when enough voices have joined the choir, the sleepers will rise. And when they do, the world will learn what those symbols really mean, and why some things are better left buried in the dark places of the earth. I've told this story to no one but family, and now I'm telling it to you. Take it as a warning, or take it as the ramblings of an old man who's seen too much. But if you ever find yourself hiking in the Appalachian Mountains, and you hear a strange humming coming from the peaks above, don't follow it. Don't try to find where it's coming from. Just turn around and walk away as fast as you can. Because once you hear the song, you'll never be able to forget it. And sooner or later, you'll find yourself humming along. This ain't one of them ghost stories you hear around campfires, made up to scare children into behaving. This is something that really happened, something that changed the way I look at the woods even now, 40 years later. Every time I see mist rolling down through them, hollers at dawn, I remember what we found up on Sycamore Ridge, and I get that same cold feeling creeping up my spine like ice water trickling down my back. It was the autumn of 1987, and I was 22 years old, working at the Consolidated Coal Mine outside of Beckley, West Virginia. Back then, coal was still king in our parts, and most every man who could swing a pickaxe or operate a continuous miner found himself descending into the earth 6 days a week. The mountains were full of young men like me, trying to make enough money to start a family or keep one fed. We lived hard and worked harder, but we also played hard when the weekend came around. That particular October was strange from the start. The leaves turned colors earlier than usual, painting the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds that seemed almost too bright, like someone had cranked up the saturation on an old television set. The air carried a peculiar stillness, the kind that makes you feel like you're holding your breath even when you're not. Old-timers at the mine kept shaking their heads and muttering about signs and portents, but us younger folks just figured it was going to be a harsh winter coming. My best friend then was a boy named Marcus Thompson, though everyone called him Tank on account of his build. Tank was 24, built like a brick shithouse with arms thick as fence posts from years of hauling coal carts. He had this infectious laugh that could fill up a whole room and make even the sourest old coot crack a smile. His daddy had worked the mines, and his granddaddy before that, so Tank knew these mountains like the back of his weathered hands. He could tell you which ridge had the best ginseng, where the biggest whitetails bedded down, and which hollers you ought to avoid after dark. Then there was Sarah Beth Caldwell, who was 19 and pretty as a spring morning. She had long auburn hair that caught the light like copper wire and green eyes that seemed to see right through you. Sarah Beth worked at the diner in town, serving coffee and pie to miners coming off their shifts. She was sweet on Tank, though she tried to hide it behind shy smiles and downcast glances. Tank was too thick-headed to notice, or maybe he was just too scared to believe a girl like her could be interested in a coal-covered mountain boy like him. The fourth member of our little group was Jimmy Garrett, who was only 18 but acted like he was 30. Jimmy was thin as a rail, with dark hair that hung in his eyes and a nervous habit of chewing on toothpicks. He'd grown up in the deepest part of Blackwater Hollow, where his grandmother had filled his head with all manner of mountain superstitions and old wives' tales. Jimmy claimed he could douse for water with a willow branch. That's water witching, for you young folks who might not know, and he swore he could feel things that weren't quite right in the world. The rest of us teased him about it, but there was something in his eyes that made you think maybe he really could sense things the rest of us couldn't. It was Jimmy who first brought up the stories about Sycamore Ridge. We were sitting in Tank's old Ford pickup after our shift one Friday evening, sharing a bottle of whiskey and planning our weekend. The ridge was about 15 miles northeast of town, a long, narrow spine of mountain that rose up like the backbone of some ancient beast. Most folks avoided it, claiming it was cursed or haunted or just plain unlucky. Jimmy said his grandmother had told him stories about people who went up there and never came back down, or came back different somehow. Tank laughed it off, as he always did with Jimmy's tales. He said the ridge was just remote and rough, full of old mine shafts and unstable ground that could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful. But Sarah Beth listened with wide eyes, and I found myself curious despite my better judgment. There was something about the way Jimmy told it, with that serious look on his face and his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, that made the hair on my arms stand up. The stories went back generations, Jimmy said. Cherokee had avoided the ridge long before white settlers arrived, claiming it was the home of something they called the Nunahai, spirit people who lived between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The Nunahi could appear human when they chose, but they belonged to neither world completely. They were guardians of sacred places, and they didn't take kindly to intruders. When white folks started mining the mountains, strange things began happening to crews that worked too close to the ridge. Men would disappear overnight, leaving behind their tools and personal belongings. Others would be found days later, wandering the woods with no memory of where they'd been or what they'd seen. The coal companies had tried to open a mine on the ridge itself back in the 1920s, Jimmy continued. They'd built a tipple, that's the structure where coal cars dumped their loads, and started sinking shafts into the mountain's belly. But the project was abandoned after only 3 months. The official record said it was due to geological instability, but the old-timers knew better. Workers reported hearing voices in the tunnels, voices that seemed to come from the rock itself. Equipment would malfunction without explanation. Men would refuse to go down into the shafts, claiming they could feel something watching them from the darkness. Tank drained the last of the whiskey and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He said Jimmy was full of horse shit and mountain moonshine, but I could see the way his eyes kept drifting toward the ridge, visible in the distance like a dark wall against the star-filled sky. Sarah Beth was quiet, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth of the evening. Even through Tank's bravado, I could tell the stories had gotten to all of us. That's when Tank made the suggestion that would change everything. He said we should go up to the ridge and see for ourselves what all the fuss was about. Make a camping trip of it, he said. Bring some food and beer, maybe do some hunting. Prove once and for all that there was nothing up there but trees and rocks and maybe a few old mine shafts. Sarah Beth protested, saying it sounded dangerous, but Tank was already warming to the idea. He had that look in his eyes that meant he'd made up his mind, and no amount of arguing was going to change it. Jimmy was against it from the start. He said his grandmother had warned him never to set foot on that ridge, that some places were meant to be left alone. But Tank kept pushing, calling him a coward and a superstitious fool. It was Sarah Beth who finally tipped the scales. She said if the boys were going, she was going too, because she wasn't about to let them go off and get themselves killed while she sat home worrying. When she put it like that, Jimmy couldn't very well let her go alone with just me and Tank for protection. So we made our plans. The following Saturday, we'd drive up to the base of the ridge and hike in with camping gear. Tank knew an old logging road that would get us most of the way there, and from there it was only a couple miles through the woods to reach the ridge proper. We'd set up camp, do some exploring, and be back by Sunday evening with stories to tell, and maybe some decent photographs to prove we'd been there. The week passed slowly, filled with the usual routine of work and sleep and work again. But there was an undercurrent of excitement, or maybe anxiety, that made everything feel different. I found myself thinking about the ridge at odd moments, wondering what we'd find up there. In my dreams, I walked through misty forests where the trees seemed to lean in close and whisper secrets I couldn't quite understand. Saturday morning dawned gray and overcast, with a chill in the air that cut right through your jacket. Thick clouds hung low over the mountains like a heavy wool blanket, and the wind carried the smell of rain and decaying leaves. Tank picked us up in his truck, the bed loaded with camping gear, coolers full of food and beer, and an old lever-action rifle that had belonged to his grandfather. Sarah Beth had packed enough supplies to last a week, despite Tank's protests that we were only going for one night. The drive to the ridge took us through some of the most remote country in West Virginia. We left the main highway and followed a series of increasingly narrow and winding roads that seemed to climb endlessly upward. The further we got from civilization, the thicker the forest became. Massive oak and poplar trees towered overhead, their branches forming a canopy so dense that even in daylight, the road was dim and shadowy. Occasionally, we'd pass the remnants of old homesteads, crumbling foundations overgrown with vines, rusted pieces of farm equipment slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Jimmy was quiet during the drive, staring out the window with that worried expression he got when he was thinking too hard about something. Sarah Beth tried to keep the mood light, chattering about her plans for the weekend and how beautiful the fall colors looked despite the overcast sky. But even her usual cheerfulness seemed forced, and I could see the way her hands twisted in her lap when she thought no one was looking. Tank kept up his usual bravado, cranking the radio loud and singing along to whatever country songs came through the static. But I noticed how his knuckles were white where he gripped the steering wheel, and how his eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, as if he expected something to be following us. The logging road Jimmy had mentioned was barely visible, just two parallel ruts carved into the forest floor and overgrown with weeds and small saplings. Tank had to shift into four-wheel drive to make it up the steep, rocky incline. Branches scraped against the sides of the truck, and more than once I was sure we were going to get stuck or slide backward down the mountain. But Tank's old Ford was tougher than it looked, and after what felt like hours of bone-jarring climbing, we finally reached a small clearing where the road ended. The silence that greeted us when Tank shut off the engine was absolute. No bird songs, no insect buzz, no wind through the trees. Just a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to press down on us like a physical weight. Even the sound of our boots on the rocky ground seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing every noise we made. We shouldered our packs and began the hike toward the ridge. The trail, if you could call it that, was little more than a game path that wound through stands of ancient hemlock and rhododendron. The air grew thicker as we climbed, heavy with moisture and the rich smell of decomposing leaves. Mist began to rise from the forest floor, curling around our ankles and making it hard to see more than a few yards ahead. It was during this hike that I first felt it, that sensation of being watched. You know the feeling, don't you? That prickle on the back of your neck that tells you someone's eyes are on you, even when you can't see anyone around. I kept turning to look over my shoulder, expecting to see another hiker or maybe a curious deer, but there was never anything there. Just the mist and the trees and that unsettling silence. Sarah Beth felt it too. I could tell by the way she stayed close to Tank, her hand occasionally reaching out to touch his arm, as if she needed the reassurance of human contact. Jimmy was practically jumping at shadows, his head swiveling back and forth like a nervous bird. Only Tank seemed unaffected, or at least he was putting on a good show of being unaffected. The ridge itself was impressive, I'll give it that. When we finally emerged from the tree line, we found ourselves standing on a narrow spine of rock that stretched for miles in both directions. The views were spectacular, valley after valley rolling away into the distance, each one filled with the brilliant colors of autumn. But there was something unsettling about the place too. something that made your skin crawl even as you admired the scenery. The trees up there were different from the ones lower down the mountain. They were older, more gnarled, with twisted branches that seemed to reach toward you like arthritic fingers. Many of them were dead or dying, their bark blackened and peeling, their bare branches stark against the gray sky. The few that still had leaves displayed colors that seemed somehow wrong, purples and deep reds that were too dark, too rich, like dried blood. We found a relatively flat spot near the center of the ridge to set up camp. Tank and I worked on pitching the tents while Sarah Beth and Jimmy gathered firewood. The work helped distract us from the oppressive atmosphere, but I noticed how quickly we all stayed within sight of each other. Nobody wanted to wander off alone, even just to collect kindling. As evening approached, the mist grew thicker. It rose from the valleys on both sides of the ridge, creeping up the mountainsides like ghostly fingers. The temperature dropped steadily, and by the time we had a fire going, we were all huddled close to its warmth. The flames seemed smaller than they should have been, as if the darkness was actively pressing against them, trying to smother the light. That's when we heard the first sounds. At first, it was just a faint rustling in the woods beyond our camp, the kind of noise you'd expect from small animals moving through the underbrush. But as the night deepened, the sounds grew louder and more distinct. Branches snapping underfoot, the scrape of something large moving through the trees, and underneath it all, a low humming sound that seemed to come from the ridge itself. Jimmy was the first to voice what we were all thinking. He said it sounded like there were people out there, moving around in the darkness, just beyond the reach of our firelight. But when Tank took his flashlight and swept it across the tree line, there was nothing to be seen, just the pale trunks of dead trees and the ever-present mist. Sarah Beth suggested we move our camp, maybe go back down the mountain and find somewhere else to spend the night. But Tank was stubborn, insisting that we were just letting our imaginations run wild. He said the sounds were probably just wind through the trees or maybe a bear foraging for food. Bears were common in these mountains, and they could make a lot of noise when they wanted to. But I'd heard bears before, and this wasn't a bear. This was something else entirely. The sounds were too rhythmic, too purposeful. They circled our camp at a distance, never getting close enough for us to see what was making them, but never going away either. And that humming sound continued, rising and falling like a distant song. We took turns keeping watch through the night, 2 people staying awake while the others tried to sleep. I drew the midnight to 3 a.m. shift with Sarah Beth, and that's when things really started to get strange. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the darkness pressed in around us like a living thing. The mist had grown so thick that we could barely see the edge of our camp, and the humming sound had grown louder, more insistent. Sarah Beth was sitting close beside me, her shoulder pressed against mine, when she grabbed my arm and pointed toward the trees. There, just at the edge of our vision, shapes were moving through the mist. At first I thought they were just shadows, tricks of the light playing against the fog. But as I watched, they became more distinct. Human figures, or something that looked human, gliding between the trees with an unnatural grace. They were tall and thin, these figures, with long hair that seemed to float around their heads like they were underwater. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their clothes appeared to be made of some kind of rough fabric that hung in tatters from their frames. They moved without making a sound, their feet never seeming to touch the ground. I shook Tank awake, trying to keep my voice calm and quiet. He sat up immediately, his hand reaching for the rifle, but when he looked toward the trees, the figures were gone. Just mist and darkness and the faint outline of dead branches. Tank looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and I was starting to think maybe I had. But then Sarah Beth spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. She said she'd seen them too. Tall, pale figures moving through the trees like ghosts. And Jimmy, who had been pretending to sleep, admitted that he'd been watching them for over an hour. He said they seemed to be studying us, learning our habits, waiting for something. Tank wanted to know why nobody had woken him up sooner. Jimmy said he'd been afraid to move, afraid that any sudden action might draw the attention of whatever was out there. The figures had been getting closer, he said, circling our camp in an ever-tightening spiral, and the humming sound was definitely coming from them. some kind of song or chant that made his teeth ache and his head feel fuzzy. We spent the rest of the night huddled together around the dying fire, taking turns watching the tree line. The figures never approached close enough for us to get a good look at them, but they were always there, just at the edge of perception. Sometimes you could see them clearly, standing between the trees like pale sentinels. Other times they were just shadows, barely visible movements in the mist. Dawn couldn't come soon enough. As the first gray light began to filter through the clouds, the figures melted away like smoke. The humming sound faded until it was just another part of the mountain's silence. We packed up our camp with shaking hands and aching backs, eager to get off the ridge and back to the safety of civilization. But as we were loading the last of our gear, Jimmy made a discovery that changed everything. He called us over to the edge of the ridge, where the rock face dropped away into the valley below. There, carved into the stone itself, were symbols unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were old, weathered by centuries of wind and rain, but still clearly visible. Spirals and curves and angular shapes that seemed to writhe and shift when you looked at them directly. Jimmy said they were Cherokee, or maybe something even older. He'd seen similar markings in caves throughout the mountains, always in places that were considered sacred or dangerous. The symbols were warnings, he said, markers left by people who understood the true nature of places like Sycamore Ridge. They told stories of the Nunahai, the spirit people who guarded the boundary between worlds. Tank was skeptical, as always. He said the symbols were probably just old mining marks, or maybe graffiti left by previous campers. But there was something about the way they were carved, the precision and artistry of them, that suggested they were far older than any mining operation. They looked like they had been made by people who understood the power of symbols, who believed that the right marks in the right places could hold back forces beyond human understanding. Sarah Beth was studying the symbols with intense fascination, tracing their outlines with her finger. She said they reminded her of something, though she couldn't quite place what. There was a familiarity to them, as if she'd seen them before in dreams, or half-remembered stories from childhood. That's when we heard the voices. At first, they were just whispers carried on the wind, so faint that you couldn't be sure they were real. But as we stood there staring at the symbols, the voices grew stronger, more distinct. They were speaking in a language none of us recognized, a flowing musical tongue that seemed to come from the very rocks beneath our feet. And then, to our horror, we began to understand them. Not the words themselves, but the meaning behind them. They were calling to us, inviting us to join them in the mist and shadows. They promised rest, eternal peace, freedom from the pain and struggles of mortal life. All we had to do was step forward, cross the threshold between worlds, and leave our old lives behind. The temptation was overwhelming. I found myself taking a step toward the edge of the ridge, drawn by the beauty and promise of those voices. Sarah Beth was moving too, her eyes glazed and distant, her hand reaching out toward something we couldn't see. Even Tank, practical Tank who didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, was swaying on his feet, his face slack with wonder. Only Jimmy seemed able to resist. He grabbed Sarah Beth's arm and pulled her back from the edge, then shook Tank and me until we snapped out of our trance. The voices grew angry then, rising to a howling crescendo that made our ears ring and our vision blur. The symbols on the rock face began to glow with a faint pulsing light, and the mist around us started to swirl and thicken. Jimmy shouted for us to run, and we didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed our packs and stumbled down the mountain as fast as our legs would carry us. Behind us, the voices continued their otherworldly song, and I could feel the presence of those pale figures following us through the trees. They didn't pursue us directly, but they were there, watching, waiting, hoping we would trip and fall or lose our way in the mist. The hike back to the truck felt like it took forever. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every rustle in the underbrush made us jump and look over our shoulders. The mist grew thicker as we descended, until we could barely see the trail ahead of us. More than once we had to stop and feel our way forward, using trees and rocks as guideposts. When we finally reached the clearing where we'd left Tank's truck, we were exhausted and shaking. But the vehicle was still there, covered in morning dew but otherwise undisturbed. We threw our gear in the back and climbed in, not bothering to organize anything properly. Tank's hands shook as he tried to start the engine, and for a terrifying moment, I thought the truck wouldn't start. But after a few tries, it roared to life, and we were bumping and grinding our way back down the logging road. None of us spoke during the drive back to town. We were all lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we'd experienced. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that there had to be a logical explanation for everything we'd seen and heard. Hallucinations brought on by stress and suggestion, tricks of light and shadow, the power of group psychology to create shared delusions. But deep down, I knew that what we'd encountered on Sycamore Ridge was real. Those figures in the mist weren't hallucinations. Those voices weren't products of our imagination. We had stumbled into something ancient and powerful, something that existed in the spaces between the world we knew and the world we feared. The strangest part was how quickly life returned to normal after that. We went back to work on Monday morning, punching our time cards and descending into the mine as if nothing had happened. Tank resumed his usual joking and storytelling, though I noticed he never mentioned our camping trip. Sarah Beth continued serving coffee and pie at the diner, but she seemed distant, distracted, as if part of her mind was still up on the ridge. Jimmy was the most affected by what we'd seen. He became even more withdrawn than usual, spending his free time reading old books about Cherokee folklore and mountain legends. He started carrying various charms and talismans, a rabbit's foot, a piece of iron pyrite, a small bag of salt. When we asked him about it, he just said he wanted to be prepared in case we encountered the Nunahai again. For a while, it seemed like we had all agreed to pretend that nothing had happened. We didn't talk about the ridge or the figures in the mist or the voices that had called to us from beyond the veil. It was easier to focus on our daily lives, to lose ourselves in work and routine and the comfortable familiarity of ordinary problems. But the ridge hadn't forgotten about us. About 2 weeks after our camping trip, strange things began to happen. Small things at first, tools that went missing from the mine, only to turn up in impossible places. Equipment that malfunctioned without explanation. Miners reporting voices echoing through the tunnels, voices that seemed to come from the rock itself. Sarah Beth started having dreams about the ridge. She would wake up in the middle of the night, disoriented and confused, with the taste of mist in her mouth and the sound of that otherworldly humming in her ears. She said the dreams were beautiful and terrifying at the same time, filled with visions of a world beyond our own where pain and suffering didn't exist. Tank tried to maintain his skepticism, but even he couldn't ignore the way his truck would sometimes start itself in the middle of the night, or how his radio would tune itself to stations that broadcast only static and whispers. He began having trouble sleeping, and when he did manage to doze off, he would wake up with scratches on his arms and legs that he couldn't explain. Jimmy's grandmother died 3 weeks after our trip to the ridge. She was found in her cabin in Blackwater Hollow, sitting in her favorite chair with a peaceful expression on her face. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but Jimmy found a note beside her body written in her careful handwriting. It said simply, "They have crossed over. The barriers are weakening. Protect the young ones." The funeral was held on a gray October day, with mist rolling through the valleys and the smell of wood smoke heavy in the air. Jimmy was inconsolable, blaming himself for what had happened. He said his grandmother had always been able to sense disturbances in the spiritual world, and that our visit to the ridge had somehow triggered something that led to her death. After the funeral, Jimmy disappeared. He didn't show up for work on Monday morning, and when Tank and I went to check on him, we found his trailer empty. His clothes were still there, his personal belongings undisturbed, but Jimmy himself was gone. The only clue was a map spread out on his kitchen table, with Sycamore Ridge circled in red ink and a note that read, "Gone to make it right." We drove up to the ridge that very night, Tank and I, hoping to find Jimmy before he did something stupid. But the logging road was blocked by a recent landslide, and we couldn't get the truck through. We tried to hike in, but the mist was so thick that we couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every path we took seemed to lead us in circles, and eventually, we had to admit defeat and turn back. The search and rescue teams found Jimmy's body 3 days later, at the bottom of a ravine about a mile from the ridge. The official report said he had fallen while hiking alone, but I knew better. Jimmy had gone back to face whatever was up there, and it had claimed him just like it had claimed so many others over the years. Sarah Beth took Jimmy's death hard. She blamed herself for not trying harder to stop him, for not recognizing the signs that he was planning something desperate. She started visiting the ridge on her own, driving up as far as she could and then hiking in through the mist and shadows. She said she could feel Jimmy's presence up there, along with all the others who had been taken by the Nunnehi. I tried to talk her out of it, tried to make her understand that the ridge was dangerous and that Jimmy's death proved we should stay away. But she was obsessed, convinced that there was something up there that needed to be understood, some truth that Jimmy had died trying to uncover. The last time I saw Sarah Beth was on a foggy November morning. She had stopped by the mine to tell me she was going up to the ridge one more time, to try to find some kind of closure. She looked tired and thin, with dark circles under her eyes and a distant expression that reminded me of the way she'd looked when the voices were calling to us from the mist. I begged her not to go, told her that Jimmy was gone and that nothing she could do would bring him back, but she just smiled that sad, beautiful smile and said she understood things now that she hadn't understood before. She said the Nunnehi weren't evil, just different, and that they were trying to help in their own way. She kissed me on the cheek and walked away, and I never saw her again. The search teams found her car at the end of the logging road, but they never found her body. Some people said she had probably fallen into one of the old mine shafts, but I knew better. Sarah Beth had found what she was looking for up on that ridge, and she had chosen to stay. Tank lasted longer than the rest of us, but the ridge got him too in the end. He started drinking heavily, trying to drown out the voices that whispered to him in the night. He would sit in his truck for hours, staring up at the distant outline of Sycamore Ridge, as if he was waiting for something. One morning, his supervisor found him at the bottom of the mine shaft, his neck broken from the fall. The official report called it an industrial accident, but I knew it was suicide. That left just me, the sole survivor of our little group. I quit the mines after Tank's death and moved away from West Virginia, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and Sycamore Ridge. I settled in Ohio, got married, had children, built a life far from the mountains and their ancient secrets. But the ridge never really let me go. Even now, 40 years later, I can feel its pull in the small hours of the night when the mist rolls in. I dream about those pale figures moving through the trees, and I wake up with the taste of mountain air in my mouth and the sound of that otherworldly humming in my ears. I've done my research over the years, studying Cherokee folklore and mountain legends, trying to understand what we encountered up there. The Nunnehi are real, or at least the belief in them is real, and that belief has power. They are the guardians of sacred places, the protectors of the boundary between worlds. They appear to those who venture too close to the veil, offering them a choice: return to the world of the living with the weight of knowledge, or cross over and find peace in the realm of spirits. Most people choose to go back, to live with the memory of what they've seen and the knowledge of what lies beyond. But some, like Sarah Beth and Jimmy, choose to stay. They become part of the legend, part of the eternal watch that guards the sacred places of the mountains. I often wonder what would have happened if we had never gone to the ridge that October night. Would Jimmy still be alive? Would Sarah Beth be married with children of her own? Would Tank still be telling his stories and making people laugh? Or were we always meant to encounter the Nunnehi, to be tested and marked by our experience? The ridge is still there, of course, still waiting for the next group of young people who think they know better than the old stories, still offering its terrible choice to those who venture too close to the veil. And somewhere in the mist and shadows, the spirits of my friends continue their eternal watch, waiting for the day when the barriers between worlds will finally fall and the living and the dead will walk together once more. Sometimes, on nights when the mist rolls in thick and heavy, I can hear their voices calling to me from the darkness. They tell me that the pain will end, that the weight of memory will be lifted, that I can find peace in the realm beyond. And sometimes, God help me, I'm tempted to answer. But I'm old now, and my time in this world is growing short. Soon enough I'll cross over on my own, without the help of the Nunnehi or the pull of Sycamore Ridge. And maybe then I'll understand what Jimmy and Sarah Beth and Tank discovered up there in the mist, what truth was worth leaving this world behind. Until then, I'll keep telling this story, warning young folks about the dangers that lurk in the old places of the mountains, because some things are older than human understanding, and some places are meant to be left alone. The ridge remembers everyone who has ever set foot on its sacred ground, and it never stops calling them home. So if you ever find yourself driving through the mountains of West Virginia, and you see a narrow spine of rock rising against the sky like the backbone of some ancient beast, you just keep on driving. Don't stop to admire the view or wonder about the stories. Don't let curiosity get the better of you, because some mysteries are too dangerous to solve, and some truths are too terrible to bear. And up on Sycamore Ridge, the Nunahai are still waiting, still watching, still calling to those who venture too close to the veil between worlds. The mist never really leaves those mountains, you know. It just hides in the hollows and valleys, waiting for the right moment to rise and claim the next group of souls brave enough or foolish enough to seek out the truth. And when it does, you can hear them singing, those ancient voices that speak of peace and rest and the end of all earthly troubles. Listen close and you might hear them yourself, but if you do, don't answer. Just keep walking and pray that you make it back to the world of the living before the choice is taken away from you.